I would like to begin by thanking the Catholic Art Institute and Kathleen in particular most sincerely for the invitation to speak at this event. I'm very grateful to everyone concerned for all the care that they've taken in the organizing of this conference, and most particularly for their concern for the sacred arts, which we all know is so precious. The title of this talk is On the Atmosphere of a Church, and is taken from Sir Ninian Comper's article Of the Atmosphere of a Church, published in 1947. Many of you will know that Comper was an architect who produced churches of sublime beauty in the 20th century, even in the late 20th century, at a time when designing traditional churches was considered hopelessly outdated and outrageously unacceptable. In this well-known article, Comper describes how the doyen of Fécamp Abbey in Normandy, France, said to him of his church that it prays for itself. Comper states, "It was a beautiful way of expressing what we mean when we say that a church has an atmosphere." And a little later, he goes on to say, "The atmosphere of a church should be such as to hush the thoughtless voice." And then continues, "Surely here today, with all our materialistic organizations, we have lost something of the sense of what a church is." I expect this last refrain is as relevant today as it was when first published. In this lecture, I propose not so much to dwell on the content of Comper's article, but rather to explore some thoughts on the making of sacred spaces through my own experience of designing 4 very modest Catholic chapels, of which 3 have been built and consecrated. I must explain immediately that I am not an expert in Catholic liturgy. The Catholic chapels that I have had the privilege to design have been funded by extraordinary patrons rather than the church itself, and I expect therefore that some margin of flexibility might have been shown in the interpretation of their architecture in relationship to current liturgical requirements. To demonstrate how an appropriate mysterious atmosphere in a church might be achieved, I will focus on 2 of the chapels which I have been fortunate enough to design. The first is that of the Chapel of Christ the Redeemer at Culham in Berkshire, shown in this image and consecrated in 2015. We will examine this in some detail, and then at the end I will briefly show you the Chapel of Our Lady at Williamstrip in Gloucestershire, which was consecrated in 2017. The ideas that were developed during the design of the chapel here at Culham are firstly the concentrated use of fabrics, both real and metaphysical, in the design of a chapel, and how this idea of the veil might imbue a chapel with a sense of mystery, which in my view is so important in a sacred space. And secondly, the need to take inordinate care in the design of every element of the chapel. I hope to demonstrate this by showing you examples of many watercolor designs which were done during the design process. And thirdly, the layering of ideas as a consequence of a close dialogue with the architecture of the dead. And then finally, the joy in attempting to produce a building which is at once familiar, but also very subtly fresh in its respectful interpretation of the past. And hopefully the forthcoming slides of both chapels will illustrate these points. The Chapel of Christ the Redeemer was consecrated, as I said, in 2015 by Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor. It was commissioned by a charity as an oratory for the use of a local parish and was supported by very extraordinary patronage. It is quite literally, as you can see, a temple on the mount, sited on rising ground in an 18th century park landscape above the River Thames in Berkshire. the temple form is immediately recognizable. However, what is perhaps a little unusual is firstly the use of materials, a combination of finely worked Portland stone, which is the white material, and local knapped flint for walling, which is the gray. Notice how on this side elevation, the Portland stone frames the semicircular windows with drapes, I put that in inverted commas, that fall either side of each window like orphreys might hang around the neck of a priest. This introduces us to a recurring leitmotif used in the chapel, that is, the idea of hanging fabrics translated into another material, in this case, stone. Elsewhere in the chapel, you will see this motif used endlessly in other materials such as timber and bronze. The temple front is also very subtly different from a conventional classical portico in that the two central columns are replaced with monumental flat pilasters supporting integral stone brackets, which in turn support bronze statues by Alexander Stabat of Saint Cecilia on the left and Saint Sabina on the right. These two beautiful, chaste figures also immediately announce that the temple contains an extraordinary program of sculpture by the greatest neoclassical sculptor of our time, Alexander Stabat. It has been, honestly, my greatest joy and privilege of my working life to have collaborated so closely with Alexander Stabat on two chapels and on so many other projects over a period of more than 20 years. I often think that my real purpose in life has been to provide architecture to house his work, and Cullum is surely a very good example of that. Briefly, I would ask you to look at an image of the Slovenian architect Josef Plečnik's Church of the Sacred Heart in Prague. Plečnik was an early 20th century architect of extraordinary genius and invention, whilst working very closely within the classical Christian tradition. He was influenced by the writings of a German architect, Gottfried Semper, and in particular his seminal book, Style. In this treatise, Semper argues that permanent buildings developed out of an idea of tent structures, and he gives the example of the tabernacle in the desert. And Plečnik takes this idea and symbolically cloaks this building in an ermine robe that hangs down the facades, cleverly and very simply represented by the paler projecting vertical bricks that you see that drop down the darker brick elevations, thereby in a perceptual way demonstrating the idea of the ermine cloak. Cloth is such an important material in the Christian church, with so many real and symbolic uses of fabrics. We think of veils and the term men of cloth, and vestments and frontals, etc. These ideas have been explored in a variety of ways in the chapel, and as a direct reference to Plečnik's church in Prague, you can see that there is a metaphorical fringe that occurs at the plinth of the building all the way around. It is therefore as if the entire chapel has been draped with a knitted cloth, represented by the knapped flint, which is the grey stone you can see there, with a finely tasseled fringe hanging at its base. And that fringe is achieved by hand-carved, scalloped, vertical fluting. A close-up of the temple front shows that fringe much more clearly. It also shows the bronze entrance doors, and above that a frieze by Alexander Stabat of Christ preaching the Sermon on the Mount. And as with classical temples from antiquity, the frieze is not immediately fully visible. It is veiled by the monumental pilasters, and this veiling is also a recurring motif in the design of the chapel, and perhaps an important way in which the mystery of faith might be represented in achieving a sacred atmosphere. In this design of the chapel, several hundred detailed watercolors were produced. one of which is shown here, of the front west bronze doors with its unusual stone surround, and above the cornice, Stoddart's Sermon on the Mount frieze. This announces that the chapel is dedicated to Christ the Redeemer and prepares us for the interior where Stoddart's monumental seated figure of Christ is placed in the sanctuary. I shall be showing you many more of these watercolors in the lecture because I hope that it shows the infinite care that is required in bringing a chapel into being. There are a few other things to point out. Notice the two black Doric Irish Kilkenny limestone columns, which are metaphorically buried in the depth of the wall, with their small, stiff stone drapes that hang down over each of the capitals, and the giant pairs of console brackets either side of the door surrounds with a stiff drape block hiding the central portion of the door frieze with its acanthus leaves. Notice also on the doors themselves the first visible use of a motif that is used throughout the chapel, that of a sprig of laurel leaves with S-shaped ribbons that relate to the patronage. The laurel was, of course, in classical antiquity, a symbol of victory, and here it is used as a symbol of victories, symbol of Christ's victory over death. This motif is hung as a motif on layers of stiff drapes that hang down again like orphreys on the bronze doors. The image on the left shows the buried Doric columns with their cloth drapes, the monumental console brackets, and the partially hidden frieze of Alexander Stoddart. Our modern world demands that everything is fiercely visible, and in so doing denies us the beauty, I think, of veiled mystery and shadows. The slide on the right shows in more detail the napped flint walls laid in diminishing courses from large at the bottom to small at the top, with a delicate stone fringe at the bottom. We enter the chapel into a small narthex with a baptistry on the right and a doorway to the left leading to the stair which gives on to the crypt and the organ loft. Our gaze, however, is focused on the sanctuary immediately with its golden mosaic dome, the altar, of course, and above that, the remarkable seated figure of Christ by Alexander Stoddart. We are immediately reminded of those Greek temples from antiquity, such as that at Olympia, with Phidias's seated figure of Zeus. These memories of the distant past, made present in the 21st century, at the very threshold of the chapel, immediately induce the hushed silence that Compa referred to. And time has somehow miraculously stood still or vanished entirely. The stone doorway leading into the nave has a garland of delicate, integral carved stone flowers draped around it, hung from a string. We are walking through a metaphorical bower of earthly flowers as we step inside the chapel. And the view from the nave this is the view from the nave with its shallow coffered load-bearing barrel vault. And the load-bearing is the operative word. This building is entirely built of stone, which is entirely self-supporting. The load-bearing stone walls and vault immediately express the permanence of the chapel. Polished black Kilkenny limestones of single shaft lengths are buried again within the depth of the stone walls, between very deep statue niches, again tell us of the solidity of this temple. And the black Kilkenny frieze, the horizontal frieze above the columns, draws the eye as a continual horizontal line towards the sanctuary. Richly polished pews, gilded bronze lights, all tell us that we are in the house of God. The light coming in is from on high, so that we cannot see out. This is a world of its own. In the entrance portico, the Doric order prevailed. In the nave, on the left and on the right. The Ionic order is contained within the depth of the walls, and in the sanctuary, a stiff-leaf Corinthian order is also buried within the wall depth. All three orders are subtly designed uniquely for the chapel, and each capital on each order is draped with a stiff stone drape, partially obscuring the capital detailing, each with a fringed end. Thus, there is a subtle progression toward refinement from the west to the east, from the Doric to the Corinthian. The sanctuary shown in another watercolor on the right. Notice how the architecture is tightly packed with buried columns and deep niches which serve as sedia, clad in polished red, blood red Holland limestone, the color of porphyry. The architecture immediately reminds us of Michelangelo's new sacristy in Florence with all its subtle Mannerist inventions. And the gilded bronze tabernacle is placed behind a cloth veil, which is placed within the pedestal of the statue. And overhead hangs a gilded sanctuary lamp, and the green ordinary time altar cloth hangs in front of the solid stone altar. One of a complete set of frontals, which were designed and which were lovingly embroidered over a period of 4 years by the Royal School of Needlework at Hampton Court Palace. The watercolor designs for the green frontal, notice how the design of the cloth now refers to the stiff drapes of the stone elsewhere in the chapel, so that real cloth is now in dialogue with a symbolic cloth embodied in the stone. These frontals also obviously hide the decoration of the stone altar, which is hardly ever seen. Another example of veiled beauty. Two further watercolor details of the frontal. Notice also the use of the laurel sprig motif pattern in the purpose-made silk damask, woven in the traditional manner in Suffolk on old-fashioned jacquard looms. The central motif is finely embroidered by the Royal School of Needlework. These are examples of watercolors that were given to the workshops so they could work with the actual painted watercolor in their workshop. Of course, Alexander Stoddart's seated figure of Christ deserves very close examination. Notice how the flat horizontal timber back to the klizmos chair reminds us of the cross, as do the crossed feet and the left hand gesturing to the side. Alexander Stoddart describes poetically how the design for the statue came to him in his studio in almost a trance-like state in a period of a couple of hours, entirely unpremeditated, as he made the first small maquette. And within the chancel arch, the depth, the vast width of the chancel arch, are Stoddart's two statues of St. John the Evangelist and St. Peter. And above them, buried in very deep niches above, are two urns, each with a stiff drape dropping down. These two apostles are also partially hidden within their niches, and as a result, their beautifully worked backs, the cloth of their backs, cannot be seen. The veiling of these details, again, is deliberate and important. Placed within the niche, the statue cannot obviously be seen fully in the round. The back is completely hidden, with all its exquisitely wrought detail. Look in particular at the beautiful hair and the enigmatic carob pod detailing on the back splat of the chair, which according to Alexander Stoddart is a subtle reference to St. John's time in the wilderness. In the same way that fully worked detail on the back of the column capitals is hidden from the viewer, the statue is also partially hidden. These details will never be seen again, and this is perhaps a potent reminder of the mysterious nature of faith. Stoddart's sculptural program at Culham pays homage to the Forfra Cathedral in Copenhagen and his sculptural program by the great neoclassical chaste Danish sculptor Berthold Thorvaldsen. His famous figure of Christ is placed on axis at the east end, arms outstretched, and mysteriously stepping backwards into the sanctuary with the words "Komma till mig," come with me, inscribed on its plinth. And the 12 apostles line the walls of the nave between the niches. A similar ambitious program is underway at Culham, and as we have seen, St. Peter and St. John are already in place, and St. Andrew, whose full-size scale model in clay is shown on the right, is currently being carved in marble in a workshop in Italy from the full-size model. The watercolor illustrates how the remaining 10 apostles will eventually be placed in niches between the buried Ionic columns in the nave. Notice the stiff stone drapes which hang around each one of the niche, each with their own fluted fringe. The bare niches await the statues of the apostles. This serves as a reminder of how long it takes to produce sculpture of the remarkable quality that Alexander Stoddard produces. It demands patience, and we all pray that we might live to see the completion of the full sculptural program. Images of the purpose-made gilded bronze lights that hang in front of each column in the nave. Notice how these also have arched orphrey-like cloths from which a string of floral motifs hang like beautiful earrings, reflecting the light from the bulb. The lights in the chapel were inspired by those designed in Westminster Cathedral, the Catholic Westminster Cathedral in London, designed by the very great architect John Francis Bentley, at a time when electricity was still something of a novelty, and architects reveled in the beauty of electricity. This is the first of many references in the chapel to the work of Bentley, and so the dialogue with the dead continues. A view from the sanctuary looking westward towards the organ loft above the west door to the nave. And here the watercolor for the west door to the nave with the organ loft balustrade above and its 4 black Kilkenny limestone urns mysteriously embedded in a deep, thick stone balustrade. Urns, as you might have gathered, is another leitmotif used throughout the chapel, and the stone door surround is a further homage to Michelangelo and his early work in 16th century Florence, with an open tympanum and central stone drape that hangs over a frieze of acanthus leaves. It is as if the frieze continues, that frieze of acanthus leaves continues behind the cloth. And note also the repeated hanging orphrey drapes in stone and timber that abound either side of the doors. 2 images of the realized west door and the organ loft above. The west doors to the nave, here the laurel sprig motif is repeated as a hanging garland, this time in marquetry, made of Swiss pearwood laid into polished walnut. And the central bronze knobs also depict the same motif designed for the chapel. And the motif is repeated on the pews as well. On the left, it's carved into the pew ends 3-dimensionally, whilst on the right, it is suspended delicately as a single motif in marquetry on the seat backrests of the pews. And the same motif is repeated again, at this time in needlepoint for the kneelers, for the pews. And so in this way, a motif special to this chapel transforms itself again and again, each time in a subtly different way, expressed in a different material. The organ loft with seating for a small choir. The gilded dome of the sanctuary and the gilded organ loft vault acts as bookends to the plain stone vault of the nave. So you have the sanctuary with its gilded dome, the plain nave with its coffered stone ceiling, and then the remaining bookend, that of the organ loft. The careful use of gold in a chapel strikes me as being surely an important aspect of establishing the atmosphere of a holy space. And we must not forget that gold relies so much on the presence of shadows. The watercolor designed for the purpose-made organ, one of the last ever made by Manders Organ Limited, with its gilded pipework and inlaid walnut case. And either side of the organ are two cupboards for organ controls and for storage. The organ case in more detail. And the trumpeting angel motif on the organ case with hanging florets that continue that theme of hanging floral motifs throughout the chapel. The watercolor was drawn full size to assist the architectural modeler to model these as accurately as possible. And the watercolor design for the coffered ceiling panels, trumpeting angels, flank the central motif of the laurel sprig, which is imprinted on a hanging cloth. The two doors either side of the organ provide access to niche cupboards within the vast thickness of the stone walls. They are housed within a stone edicule with stiff drapes and with fluted fringes. The door itself has an exuberant pattern of 3 trumpets and S-shaped ribbons, which are mysteriously identifiable just about as S-shaped ribbons. So we leave the organ loft and descend the stair to the baptistry situated directly below on the ground floor. And here we see the altar and reredos on the east wall. Of course, all symbolic references in the room are to St. John. And the triptych painted in oil on wood depicts St. John, flanked either side by his father Zachariah and the angel Gabriel. This is set within a gilded timber frame on a gradine. That frame, in turn, is framed by a carved and gilded stone orphery surround. The timber frame has a pierced frieze, and the gradine has kneeling angels either side of a central Agnus Dei. All of the forms are classical. However, the overall effect is perhaps more Gothic than classical. And this, in a modest way, pays homage to Compe's idea, Sir Ninian Compe's idea, of unity by inclusion in his late work, where he included the work motifs, classical motifs and Gothic motifs in the most extraordinary, fresh and beautiful way. The watercolor study for the triptych. And the gradine, notice the crosses between the angels are St. John's familiar simple form of the cross, and this is hung with S-shaped ribbons, and the bees are buzzing about as a reference to his time, of course, in the wilderness. All the silver in the chapel was designed rather than found, and here we see the cross and candlesticks for the baptistry altar. The south wall of the baptistry contains a side entry door to the exterior. It too is in bronze, verdigris bronze, with hanging stiff cloth panels with a fish and fig leaf motif designed for this room. The semicircular window above has the only use of stained glass in the chapel, where St. John, after Chima de Corneliana, is depicted against a Renaissance honor cloth, also incorporating the fish and fig leaf motif design. And either side of the door are cupboard niches created from the depth of the stone wall to house the holy oils. A color study for the stained glass window, and even here the idea of hanging cloth is used, this time in what the Renaissance artists such as Giovanni Bellini would probably have known as honor cloths. we are reminded of the many Madonna and Child representations by Bellini, which makes use of this motif. The watercolor of the inlaid walnut doors, the baptistry cupboards. The panels themselves are expressed as drapes, and the kneeling angels hold Christ's clothes whilst he's being baptized. These are the angels that are so very often depicted in Renaissance paintings of the baptism and the completed inlaid doors. Positioned centrally in the baptistry is Alexander Stoddart's tender marble figure of an angel holding the font in the form of a shell. This is a poignant tribute to the kneeling angel font by Thorvaldsen in the Forfrø-kirke, which we saw in Copenhagen in an earlier slide. With the inclusion of this beautiful figure, the sculptural program in the chapel completes the same full set of statues that Thorvaldsen made for the Forfrø-kirke. That is a figure of Christ, the 12 apostles, and an angel holding a font. This is a moving account of how homage can be paid between artists of different periods. And so in this sculptural program, we have two great neoclassical artists in close communication despite being separated by more than 200 years. To conclude our visit to the baptistry, here we have the exterior of the bronze doors set into a Portland stone surround, which in turn is surrounded by the napped flint. And the composition is very obviously, again, a tribute to Michelangelo's Mannerist architecture, with slender console brackets supporting a shouldered architrave that steps up in the center and becomes a stiff central drape with its fluted fringe, which again corresponds with all the other drapes on the exterior. Two deep recessed niches are created at high level either side, above the shoulders of the architrave, and these each contain a classical urn in black Kilkenny with a single drape centered on the urn. Leaving the baptistry, we cross the narthex and proceed through a screened doorway, a veil, if you like, to the stair which leads down to the crypt and up to the organ loft. This screen is yet another tribute, in particular, to John Francis Bentley's side chapels in Westminster Cathedral in London. The stair is a solid Ballinasloe limestone oval cantilever stair with a solid balustrade. A more complicated feat of precision traditional masonry perhaps could not be devised. Its solidity and monumentality contribute, however, significantly to the atmosphere of a stone building by linking the stone interiors of all the levels of the upper chapel, the organ loft, and the crypt. At the base of the stair, at crypt level, a red Holland holy water stoup is set into a lined Holland niche, which in turn is set into the Portland stone wall. Notice that even this wall has its own stone drapes, which stop just above a stone dado. In this way, the stone materials used in the chapel, in the upper chapel, and the chapel's unique motifs are subtly brought down and repeated in the crypt. The stair doorway on the left provides access to the crypt narthex. On the right is the door into the Lady Chapel, which we will explore after seeing the lower chapel. Directly ahead, however, is the doorway into the lower chapel. This doorway is a variation on the theme of the baptistry exterior door, which we saw a short while ago, with a pair of urns set very deeply into niches separated again by a central stiff drape. The urns are here perhaps even more poignant, as the lower chapel is designed to hold interments in the future with stone-lined chambers set below the floor. To add to the sepulchral atmosphere, the pairs of doors themselves leading into the crypt are constructed out of solid, carved, and decorated Ballinasloe limestone slabs, single slabs, 4-inch thick limestone slabs. A detail of the doors, which of course are a reminder of the heavy stone which close Christ's tomb. They too have integral orphrey-like drapes and a pattern of vine leaves that articulate the center of each door and obviously speak of the Eucharist. By now you will have noticed the emphasis on hanging elements. These are what can be called gravity-loving elements rather than the gravity-defying elements which the modernists so aspire to. This emphasis, I think, also speaks subtly of the crucifixion in a subtle way. The lower chapel looking east toward the sanctuary, and the atmosphere of this chapel is subtly different to that of the upper chapel. A lime-plastered structural groin vault is supported on a Doric order, which is closely based on the Greek Delian order. The grey Ballinasloe limestone is delicately tooled. Every surface is delicately tooled with a chisel, with a vertical chiseling pattern, all across all surfaces. This tooling of the surfaces helps to give the crypt its sepulchral subterranean atmosphere. And as with the upper chapel, the natural light which is brought in is at high level by means of semicircular windows connected to external light wells, and a gilded bronze screen, another veil, encloses the sanctuary. A watercolor section through the narrow aisles and the central nave and the sanctuary with its gilt screen. Do we have the next slide? A close-up view of the screen and altar. The screen continues the theme of frozen drapes, decorated with the color motif. Urns, in this case, take the form of the Greek lakithos vase, which was the vase which specifically held those oils used to anoint the dead. The watercolor of the screen. This is an early design for a silver and gilt altar cross, much influenced by the work of Comper and Bentley for the crypt. In the end, a gilt silver cross was made to this particular design, a little unusual, perhaps, in that it incorporated blood-red enameled elements inspired by the Renaissance examples of the Pogliuolo brothers in Florence from the 16th century. The gray and white pattern of masonry in the crypt refers, of course, directly to the early Renaissance Florentine pattern of gray Pietra Serrano sandstone with white walls that one sees in the work of Brunelleschi and then followed on by Michelangelo. And each of the semicircular windows are surrounded by orphrey-like drapes again, as elsewhere in the chapel. And below the windowsill, tablets of Portland stone await memorial inscriptions which will, in time, be carved when interments are made in the chambers seen here in the floor of the aisle. And the watercolor of the aisle wall shows the pierced bronze grills that cover the windows, and the pattern of these alternate between urns with S-shaped ribbons and butterflies with an hourglass, obvious symbols of immortality and mortality. And the windows are glazed unusually not with glass, but instead with translucent alabaster, a material used in early churches in Europe prior to the use of glass. These admit a pearly, mysterious light which is so appropriate, I think, to a sepulchral space and what I suppose used to be referred to as a dim religious light. A view from the sanctuary looking west through the crypt. And the same view, but from within the nave of the crypt. A detail of the solid stone doors to the crypt. And here we have another remarkable sculptural program of reliefs from Alexander Stoddart, executed in the same limestone as the doors. The tympanum above the doors, with its shallow arch and deep recess, is obviously redolent of Christ's tomb, and depicted within are the two shining angels that Mary saw when she looked in and saw the empty tomb. The watercolor design for the doors, either side are two smaller reliefs, also by Alexander Stoddard, that continue the theme of Christ's entombment. Notice the two garlands, vertical hanging garlands of larger-than-life acorns that hang down the inner edges of the architraves, yet another example of hanging or suspended elements. A detail of the tympanum, and the reveals of the doorway contain the small reliefs which are mysteriously hidden or veiled when the stone doors are in the open position, of course. And here we have the two stone bar reliefs shown side by side. On the left, the Noli me tangere moment as Mary recognizes the risen Lord, and on the right, St. John and his companion apostle look into the empty tomb with the circular heavy stone door rolled away from the tomb entrance. The stone doors in the closed position. From the crypt, we approach the entrance to the Lady Chapel, which is glimpsed again through another veil, through a screen, through the gilt bronze balusters, the window openings in the stone screen. And the Lady Chapel is perhaps where the influence of Bentley, John Francis Bentley's side chapels in Westminster Cathedral, are most keenly felt. The images here are of two of these beautiful chapels within Westminster Cathedral. The use of marbles to provide color, the careful use of gilded elements, together with gilded screens, were all important references, together with the mysterious atmosphere created by these screens and materials. The east wall of the Lady Chapel with the altar and gilded edicule as a reredos, with a poignant painted bronze, unusually, a poignant painted bronze statue of Our Lady by Alexander Stoddard. The altar seen here, without its altar frontal, is finely worked in honed black Kilkenny and red Holland, with gilded integral stone decoration. Flanking the altar are two red Irish marble candlesticks from Cork as Ionic columns of the Bassi order, which is the same Ionic order that was used in the nave of the upper chapel, but here modified very subtly to incorporate a centrally placed lily. Everywhere, as you would expect, symbols of the Virgin abound. On the right, the watercolor shows the edicule doors when closed. The altar with its green frontal on the left, hiding the decoration of the stone altar behind, and a detail of the statue, which is made in that sweet Renaissance manner of the Florentine sculptor Desiderio da Settignano and his followers. Silver was designed for the altar, incorporating that same Ionic order that we saw in the candlesticks, and again the ever-present drape motif. On the south wall, opposite the entrance door, is an exquisite painted bronze relief by Alexander Stoddard. The Virgin is unusually held in her mother's lap, prefiguring the Pieta, perhaps, with the young Christ and St. John the Baptist either side. The composition, of course, is a subtle reference to Leonardo da Vinci's famous cartoon in the National Gallery in London, where the Virgin is mysteriously perched on her mother's lap. The west wall opposite the altar has three fixed inlaid walnut seats with a Marian prayer inscribed in the stone wall behind, flanked by carved stone drapes with a pattern of lilies. In the watercolor, the central kneeler is also shown with its pierced lily pattern screen. The north wall is the entrance screen and doorway, and above the gilded doors with their balusters and lily and S-shaped ribbon panels is a niche with a further relief by Stoddard of Elizabeth, the mother of St. John, shown as an elderly woman, referring obviously to her being barren and then miraculously conceiving. The Lady Chapel there in a poignant way depicts all ages of women, adding a feminine poignancy, I think, to this very small sacred space. And the watercolor of the north wall. The part gilded walnut coffered ceiling represents, of course, the starlit sky of the heavens in honor of Our Lady, Queen of the Heavens. And timber coffers miraculously become the night sky. And the finished ceiling. Each coffer has a carved and gilded floret hanging down from its center vertically. Flowers miraculously become stars. The watercolor of the prie-dieu and a detail of the needlepoint Nila for the Nila with its lily motif. So we leave the Lady Chapel and enter the sacristy, and this is where the silver investments are all kept, all purpose designed for the chapel. And here a holly sprig motif has been designed for this room, again inlaid with walnut, inlaid in the walnut cupboard doors. The priest's lavabo in the sacristy. The bronze door handles here also make reference to St. Eustace with the deer head surmounted by the cross. A reference also to the deer in the park at Culham, beyond the walls of the chapel itself. And the watercolor design for the door handles. All of the silver designed for the chapel, as I said, is kept in the sacristy when not in use, and here we see most of that set. I'm going to walk through them very quickly for you, the designs. The chalice and the pattern. The stem of the chalice has its own stiff fabric drape and fringe, and the red carnelian knop makes reference, obviously, to the blood of Christ. And the pattern has the image of the vernicle, the veil of Veronica, which is, of course, one of the most sacred of cloths. The watercolor design for the chalice, and the design for the pattern. The thurible, with its laurel leaf sprig as a pierced screen. And the wine and water vessels, incorporating red cornelian as well, and notice how the handles repeat the S-shaped motif. A candle dowser, and it too incorporates the lily, the laurel motif, the Culham laurel sprig motif. A collection bag, which again incorporates the motif, lined with a beautiful red velvet. And a Bible stand, the same motifs are employed here. And again, another watercolor of one of the elevations of the Bible stand. The silver processional cross or corpus by Alexander Stoddart, an exquisite example of his work at small scale, which is kept in the sanctuary on the chancel arch in the upper chapel. This processional cross led the consecration from the 18th century house, Culham Court, to the chapel on the cold but beautifully clear and sunny morning of the 9th of December 2015. I introduced these photos of the procession to also illustrate the vestments, some of the vestments which were designed for the chapel and which were made by Watson Co. in London. You must all imagine in your mind's eye the choir singing choral music composed especially for the consecration by Sir James Macmillan during the procession. The late Cardinal Murphy O'Connor, who officiated during the consecration, and his co-celebrants dressed in the vestments made for the chapel. The Culham sprig and ribbon features not only on the exterior of the vestments, but also on the specially designed and woven silk damask, which you can see for the blue linings on the interior of the vestments. Here, the consecration procession approaches the entrance steps to the chapel. Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor at the entrance door, just prior to that moment to being given the keys to the chapel. What a joy it has been to design these vestments and the fabrics which went into their making, especially when so much of the design of the constructional fabric of the building focused on the idea of transformation of fabrics metaphorically into other materials such as bronze, stone, and timber. And here we have the vestal chasuble worn during the consecration. and a detailed design for the embroidered panel on the festal chasuble worked by the Royal School of Needlework. The watercolor design for the deacon's dalmatic, and the design for the embroidered panel for the purple chasuble. Here, too, the laurel sprig and S-shaped ribbons are very subtly employed in the pattern. In addition to the vestments, a full set of altar frontals were designed for the upper chapel and also for the Lady Chapel. And here we see the Lady Chapel green frontal design. And here it is as a finished frontal, beautifully embroidered and made up by the Royal School of Needlework. The Red Lady Chapel frontal design, in this instance, the S-shaped ribbons intertwine with the lily. The design for the festal frontal for the Lady Chapel depicting the Annunciation, and the frontal as executed. The design for the Lady Chapel purple frontal, notice how the guilloche pattern on either side mirrors the same decorative pattern that is carved on the stone altar hidden behind the frontal. The embroidery depicts the meeting of the risen Christ with his mother in the vision of St. Ignatius. The design for the festal frontal of the upper chapel, the two shining angels kneel either side of the empty bier in the tomb, with the entombment cloth draped over the stone bier. Fabric designs mirroring designs cut in stone used in the crypt, as we saw earlier. And the same design beautifully realized by the Royal School of Needlework. The purple frontal design for the upper chapel, and the central motif, embroidered motif for the same design. And here we have the design for the red frontal, incorporating orphrey-like hangings in red velvet and a red, gold, and black silk damask, purposely designed and made, incorporating the column motif. The form of this particular frontal and the green frontal, together with the green frontal, takes inspiration from surviving rare Renaissance painted frontal timber panels in imitation of fabric frontals, which I first saw in Brunelleschi's wonderful Santo Spirito in Florence many years ago. So here we have a real fabric frontal inspired by a painted timber frontal, which was originally in imitation of a real fabric frontal. The watercolor design for the laurel sprig and ribbon fabric. So our tour of the chapel at Cullum is almost complete, and I hope that it has conveyed something of that atmosphere of that chapel. Before we leave Cullum, I shall leave you just with an external view of the temple on the mount from across the park with its herd of deer in the foreground. This is the approach to the second chapel. It's the Chapel of Our Lady at Williamstrip Park, consecrated in 2017. And as with Cullum, this chapel is located within the grounds of an 18th century house, partly by the famous Regency architect Sir John Soane. It is even more modest in scale than Cullum, consisting only of a narthex, nave, and sanctuary, and built without an organ loft and without a crypt. However, like Cullum, it is immediately recognizable as a classical temple. Unlike Cullum, it is entirely private, although services are often held in it for the local Catholic congregation. The exterior is deliberately austere and monumental, in contrast with the jewel-like richness of the interior. The west front is shown here, built of local limestone. A monumental single arch celebrates the entrance, and we see immediately that the chapel is devoted to the Virgin. The west doors in bronze with lilies growing from beautiful, simple urns, and a Portland stone depiction of the Annunciation based on a Luca della Robbia from the Ospedale in Florence is placed above the door surround. Some of the ideas developed in the design of Cullum, which predates this chapel, are continued here, and in particular, notice the floral garlands that drop down in deep vertical recesses either side of the door, giving the entrance the feminine grace that a temple to the Virgin demands. The north and south side elevations are equally monumental and perhaps even more abstract, with broad pylon-like pilasters either side acting as bookends to the rhythm of windows. The window surrounds with their rectangular block-like console brackets are a direct reference to the work of Michelangelo at the Laurentian Library in Florence. So again, references to dead architects. Notice the orphery-like drapes again, which hang down in an abstract manner either side of the windows, each with their own little fluted fringes. Notice also the way in which the moldings of the top capital moldings of the broad pilasters are repeated, but in very, very deep recesses set just below the entablature between the windows. Stepping inside, we enter a narrow narthex separated from the nave by a pierced screen of stone, polished walnut, and gilt bronze. And beyond our gaze is focused obviously on the sanctuary with its golden mosaic dome and a monumental baldacchino above the altar. The nave also displays some affinities with Cullum, in particular the Corinthian columns, buried in the depth of the wall again, mysteriously. The atmosphere of this chapel is perhaps subtly different because of the result of the presence of stained glass windows flanking the nave. The sanctuary with its monumental baldacchino, deliberately as tall as possible, with its coffered stone and marble barrel vault representing the heavens. The use of black limestone is similar to that at Cullum, but instead of its combination with a red limestone, a white Carrara marble is used, which establishes a subtly different atmosphere and aesthetic. The corpus is hung within a niche behind the altar and immediately above the tabernacle, shown here on the right, which is expressed as a miniature sacred temple in the same black limestone and white marble. A floral garland drapes, which we first encountered either side of the entrance door of the chapel, are repeated here in pairs of drops either side of the central niche. The detail of the carved stone Eucharistic drape with its fluted fringe to the reveals of the chapel shown on the left, and on the right the priest's chair in the foreground with its inlaid lily motif and purpose-made cushion, again using a silk damask with a lily pattern. The same fabric was used to make up the festal frontal altar. And behind the chair, in this case, is a bronze museum copy of St. Anthony of Padua from that wonderful cycle of his for the altar in Padua by Donatello. The nave walls establish a rhythm of buried columns again, with semicircular clear glass windows above the entablature and with the rectangular windows below presented as edicules containing purpose-designed stained glass images of female saints, beautifully executed by Jim Budd. The same floral garlands drop either side of each window, helping to give these edicules a feminine grace. Two of the stained glass windows with their delicate coloration intended to work closely with the color of the architecture and to give a subtle golden glow to the interiors. The Stations of the Cross are perhaps a little unusually depicted in the predella-like stained glass images, but below each of the female saints. The view from the sanctuary looking west, and notice here the decorated blanket-like fabric drapes to the vaulted plaster ceiling, each interspersed with a symbolic orphery drape. And from here, the narthex screen can be seen stretching across the full width of the chapel. The screen with its Marian theme of pierced gilded bronze semicircular lunettes. On the left, the Visitation. In the center, the meeting of the risen Christ and the Virgin, as in the vision of St. Ignatius. And on the right, the Annunciation. These are double-sided images, Behind and above the screen is the west stained glass window with the Virgin and Child enthroned, flanked by St. Anne and St. Joseph. Notice the decorative floral drapes and deeply inset garland drops which radiate exuberantly in an arch above the west window, all integrally carved into the depth of the stone of the west wall. So to end our tour of the Chapel of Our Lady at Williamstrip, we are in the narrow narthex with the baptismal font on the one side and a small restored early 19th century manual foot-pumped organ opposite, which is not shown here. The font is depicted in these images, and unusually it has an ornate font cover which opens up to reveal painted and gilded standing saints which preside over the baptism and which reveals under the soffit of the canopy the dove of the Holy Spirit. The Agnus Dei motif is carved into the stone front, and it seems perhaps appropriate for us to end at the beginning, as it were, with an image of a baptistry. I began with extracts from St. Ninian Compa's text, and I would like to conclude with a poignant passage, I think, from the same article of the atmosphere of a church. A church built with hands, as we are reminded at every consecration and dedication feast, is the outward expression here on earth of that spiritual church built of living stones, the bride of Christ, Urbs Beata, Jerusalem, which stretches back to the foundation of the world and onwards to all eternity. With her Lord, she lays claim to the whole of his creation and to every philosophy and creed and work of man which his Holy Spirit has inspired. And so the temple here on earth, in different lands and in different shapes, and in the east and in the west, has developed or added to itself fresh forms of beauty. And though it has suffered from iconoclasts and destroyers, both within and without, and perhaps nowhere more than in this land, it has never broken with its past. It has never renounced its claim to continuity. To enter, therefore, a Christian church is to enter none other than the house of God and the gate of heaven. I hope that for those who visit these two chapels that I've illustrated, that they might, in some very, very modest way, metaphorically represent something of the gates of heaven that Compa speaks of. Thank you.